So we already looked at what a stance is in martial arts and some of the misconceptions around the concept of the stance. And we briefly explained what the stance actually does in the martial arts and how it's applied. And we looked at a front stance. So if you missed that video, please be sure to check that out up here. I'll also put a link in the description, because in this video we're going to go into a bit more detail on the front stance, so that even if we're stepping forward or stepping backward or dropping down in place, we still have the feel and the function of a front stance as opposed to a different kind of stance. So last time we learned what a front stance is supposed to look like, our foot position, kind of the width and the depth and all of that, the kind of proportions of the position, or our legs and where our body is supposed to face and all that basic stuff. This time we'll go a little bit more in depth on how to get into it, how to move into a front stance, whether moving forward or backward or dropping down into it, and a couple of drills to help us get the hang of what the front stance is supposed to feel like, so that when we apply it, it can be effective. And then we'll also look at adding a bit of rotation into our techniques in a front stance to make them more powerful, to allow our hips and legs. The legs are sort of the powerhouse of strength in our body, and if we have a strong legs and strong core and everything works properly together, if we have rotation into a front stance, we can have a really powerful strike or block or technique, whatever it is. And so we'll have a couple of drills that work on pivoting, work on rotation, so that when we integrate that into our front stance and into the other stances as well, and apply them in an actual combative situation, then we will be able to use the front stance properly and effectively. So just again to briefly review the position, one foot's in front, one foot's in back, going about shoulder width apart, and then forward, maybe 2 shoulder width. We don't want it to be too long, we don't want it to be too wide, because we don't want to sacrifice our agility just for a nice looking pose. We don't want to do that, right? We want to be able to get in and out of the stance when we need to, right? It's not an overcommitment into a deep stance like you're taking a picture. No, because this is a snapshot of actual dynamic motion. I'm gonna strike, but even if I'm practicing the stance as a kind of a still shot, we want to make sure that that will carry over into when we actually apply the stance. So we want our 10 toes forward. We want to make sure our back heel, really both heels, but back heel especially on the ground. And so that means we'll have to stretch out the calf. We want this back leg straight. And then our ankle and heel is sort of twisted, pivoted out. So that the corner, if we make a sort of box with our feet, the corner, back corner is going to be the heel. And the front corner is going to be these front toes over here. Right, so everything is straight. We have our front knee bent. So if I look down with good posture, I look down. Right, I'm not slouching over, I'm not tilted back so much. If I'm upright and I look down, I shouldn't be able to see my toes, and then maybe bend a little bit more, just to feel that burn a little bit, to strengthen those muscles. And this is our front stance position. All right, so let's work on getting into that and out of that without adding rotation yet, just going straight forward and going straight backward. So we start from a ready stance, and really we'll just take the hands out of the picture right now, just to focus on the feet and the hips to see what they're doing. And so as I step forward, we want to start with the left foot. It's going to step forward. You want to imagine sort of train tracks, so 2 parallel tracks going forward. We don't want to be on one line because it will be a bit more wobbly if we're kind of on sort of a tightrope here. Instead, we want to have a wider base that's about shoulder width, maybe slightly wider, and then comfortably long forward as well. So again, I'm bending my knee so they can't see my toes, and I really want to focus on this back foot too. This, as we get tired, especially if we're new, we're not quite at that level of endurance to maintain the stance very long, this might come up as our body tries to cheat because we're tired. But I want to focus especially on this back foot, so make sure that heel is back toward that corner, so our toes are forward and our ankle is kind of stretching right now with the calf too, keeping this knee straight, because our power and our stability is going to start in this back foot. That's what's planting me, it's what's posting me forward. If I need to resist and push forward, or if I need power to step forward, it's going to come from what becomes the back leg. So if I'm stepping, it's this front leg pushes to then become the back leg. I want to try not to come up so much and then fall back down, because it becomes a bit more of a swing if I shoot myself up and then just kind of fall back down. There's a bit less control there, and I'm not able to focus my energy forward as it is a front stance. I want to be able to exert the force forward rather than falling downward. So instead of coming up and falling back down and catching myself in the stance, I want to really stay sort of level. So if you have a mirror, you want to try to make sure you're not popping up and down. You want to stay sort of level as you're going forward. If you're really intense, you can tape a little string or yarn or something, to the wall, to the other end of the wall, so it's going across the room. you know, at a low enough level that it's going to kind of challenge you for a front stance, and you want to try to maintain where you're not touching it with your hair or with your head, and try to see if you can do that. But for the rest of us who aren't such overachievers and we're just going to practice normally, no, I do appreciate you overachievers, don't get me wrong. And what we're going to do is just try to focus on coming to this foot, stepping back out without popping up. All right, try to stay level this way and then come back out. Right, it's not the prettiest of stances, it's not the prettiest of transitions, but it's just to focus on the strength of this front foot as it becomes the back foot. Right, this is particularly for moving forward. It's a bit different if we're moving back. However, we'll see as we step back, then this back foot is going to take some of that load as we come back this way. It works a little bit differently in application, but it's a good drill to go through. We come back, try to stay level, so we'll have to sort of bend it as we come back. It's good for flexibility of your ankles especially too, so you want to be careful you don't roll it, but make sure you're stretched out. So from here, what I want to do is I actually want to bring my feet together and then come back out. Right, so it's not just straight forward like a sumo wrestler, but rather I'm coming in and out, something like maybe figure skating. Coming in, coming out, in and out, but still forward. We're not adding rotation yet, and I'm trying to stay level. I'm not trying to pop up and down, but stay level as I come forward. Right, and again, as I do that, I'm trying to have my deep stance, make sure all the positioning is right, and when I'm ready to move, bring my feet together, so sort of a, not really a crouch, but my knees are bent and I'm ready to spring forward into the stance. Right, you don't have to do it fast at first. You can just bring your feet together and then step back out and get used to that transition into the front stance. You don't want to lean too far forward, you don't want to lean too far back, you don't want to be too narrow, you don't want to fall over. So you want to get used to the feeling of being sturdy in the stance and then switching to another one as you step forward. And we can do the same thing moving backward as well. So if I come back this way and then step back and try to plant myself here and have that be strong and sturdy to give me stability if I need to come backward, but then have a stopping point, not be driven back and trip and fall. Right? Because one of the uses of the front stance is to resist pressure backwards. When they're trying to push me, I can swing my foot back to sort of post and plant so that I can resist with some strength, right? And then do whatever we have to. But if I'm not used to that foot being solid and giving strength to the stance and stability and structure to the stance, and that's going to be my weak point, and I might fall back and it might take me down, and that's not good. Or we want to avoid going to the ground in a self-defense situation. Then we want to train to be able to defend ourselves to an extent if we do fall, but we don't want to go there. All right, and each time we're making sure that the back foot is posting strong, trying to keep our toes forward, but most especially for this, that our back heel is really the point of strength for the rest of the stance. Right, that's sturdy, that's strong. I have the whole posterior chain on the left side, or the back side, whatever it is, firing to keep that strong and straight, almost like a deadlift, where we press forward, right, and we fully extend the legs and the butt. We're doing that here by pushing the hips forward and giving our stance and posture strength. This one's just supporting it. So if I step forward, it's a powerful movement forward, and if I step backward, it's catching myself so that I don't trip backward. Briefly, a variation of going backward is just going straight down. So if somebody's trying to pick you up, you want to widen your base, try to bring your center of mass down. One of the ways to do that, any wide stance will do. I wouldn't do a back stance or a cat stance, or I wouldn't do that, but maybe a big horse ride stance or a big front stance. And so what we want to do is just drop down. Right? There's a bit more nuance to it than that, but in general, the idea is to just sink your weight down into a big, wide front stance. Somebody's trying to bear hug you from the front or from the back, or otherwise trying to grab you, take you down. This is sturdier, and this is much more difficult to compromise. If this video has been helpful to you so far, please give it a like and share it with someone who could benefit from it. Thank you. So then if we want to add a bit more dynamism, a bit more power to our stance, now we have to incorporate a bit of rotation. So we're not just thinking one-dimensionally or even two-dimensionally, we want to think in 3 dimensions by rotating away and then snapping back forward with whatever technique we're doing, if it's a punch, if it's a block, if it's whatever. So I like to illustrate this concept with a high block because it's a swinging motion. It's easy to see how the stance adds a whole lot of power to it. So starting back here in our ready stance, again, I'm going to start with my left side, and so I'll prepare. I step out, and there's my high block in my front stance. But if I didn't rotate at all, it would be a bit more bland, I think, as a stance. If I just come forward, that's pretty good. I mean, everything's kind of in the right spot, but it's not that strong. I mean, it's decently strong, but it's not as powerful as it could be. And if you need it, it won't be as effective as it might need to be. So instead of just going straight forward, up and down in this plane, we want to think in terms of rotation. Pivoting away off center, or off axis, and then snapping back, right? So away and then springing back to center. So what I want to do is now look at my hips. You can feel where your hips are, but for some sort of visual feedback, if you're wearing a belt, the knot on your belt should be in the middle unless you're tying it odd. Or if you have hair, if you have long hair, it'll flip-flop. If you do this motion properly, if you have a belt, it'll kind of flip-flop, or some sort of clothing that allows you to see if your hips are turning properly and quickly. And so if I rotate off center and then snap back, there's a little bit of a flop to the belt, or to the hair if you have hair. All my hair's falling out. If I rotate this way and then snap back, there's a little bit of movement there. Now if I do it too slowly, not really. So we need to make sure that it's quick enough that it'll actually accelerate and generate some power. So if I bring my feet together, and this time, instead of just being straight forward and then coming back out to a front stance, when my feet are together and my knees are bent, I'm actually going to allow myself to turn about 45 degrees, not too much, just to get the feel of it. And then as I step back out, I'll spring back at the last moment, back to center. So I bring my feet together and allow myself to turn a little bit off axis, off center. I'll bring my foot out and then at the last moment, spring back to center. And when we do it at full speed, it'll be a bit smoother, but as we're practicing, it might feel a little awkward, because it is if you're not used to it. So I bring my feet together. Right, I don't necessarily have to set down into this weird kind of middle-ish stance and then switch. If I'm doing it in slow motion, I do it because I can't hold myself up like that. But as I do it faster, as I come here, my little pivot of the hip is going to happen before I set down, or as I step down. So we'll see what that looks like. Turn away and back. Turn away and back. Turn away and back. Should have a little bit of a flop on each step. And of course, especially if we're new to this stance, each step, each position, each front stance, we want to make sure that everything's in the right spot so we're not reinforcing bad habits. And so as we're stepping in, if we realize, oh, we're not quite rotated all the way, make sure we fix that before we move on. So one drill to work on this is pivoting a little bit more than we might going down the floor. We're going down the floor, we might rotate off axis maybe 45 degrees and then really push back to the center for some power. To exaggerate that, let's try doing 90 degrees. Pivoting from corner to corner or just from wall to wall, right? 90 degrees for a stance this way and a stance this way. And see what I just did there? I want to pivot back and forth. Right? So if I go to the corner, I have lights here. This way, this way, this way, this way. And if your belt isn't flopping or your hair isn't flopping, then we need to go faster. And you go back and forth. And you start this way. That's focusing on the hip rotation, pivoting from the hip. And as you go, as you get used to the feeling of the hip pivoting quickly, you want to try to focus on it originating from what will become the back foot. So if I switch this way, this will be the back foot. So we want to make sure this is grinding into the ground to push me forward. This one's going to be the back foot as I twist this way, so that way. So to apply that over-exaggeration while stepping forward from our ready stance, we can just turn all the way over this way, set back out, and pivot forward. So then we go this way, 90 degrees off center, step on out, pivot forward. Once you get the hang of that, try to get it in one smooth motion, not stepping, then switching, but pivoting as you step. So start from the prepare, so sit down here, but then step out, and then pivot as we set down, not after. Right, so we're not going into this sort of front stance this way or in betweenish stance here, then switching. We're doing the pivot as we step, so with the foot still in the air, as we sit down. Right, so we start here, and then as we sit down, pivot forward. So then as we go back to center and then remove the over-exaggeration and return back toward what the actual motion is going to look like, it'll be maybe 30, maybe 45 degrees of rotation off center, depending on the technique, depending on if it's a normal or a reverse motion, depending on a few different things. Kicks are different too. But in general, if I were to do a high block, I'll rotate a bit off and then snap back to center. And so maybe 45, and then back to center, right? I'm not going to rotate too far because that takes away from the actual practicality of the technique. So while exaggerated practice is good to learn the concepts, the underlying concepts, when we then apply it to our normal training, we want to make sure to remove the over-exaggerated part of it too. Here, so for a high block, this bottom hand is going to come up, so I turn off and come back to center. Right, and I'm not really focusing on the hands right now because I'm illustrating the stance, but everything working together. This is sort of pulling me forward, and the hips are just helping me to drive forward, starting at this base leg in the back. So once again back here, I'm going to go about 45 degrees off and then snap forward. So removing that over-exaggerated component of our training to more closely approximate the normal front stance transition with some rotation. So we're using a high block for an example. I'll step a little off and step out. Prepare, off a little bit, and then back forward. Prepare, off a little bit, and forward. Repair. And each time we want to make sure if we need to make little adjustments to our technique before stepping to the next motion, that's just fine. We want to make sure we reinforce the proper positioning, the proper technique every time. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, what else you'd like me to cover, and any drills that you've come across in your own training or elsewhere on YouTube that are helpful for learning how to do a front stance. Until next time, fruitful training and have a great life.